What up, what up, what up? Alright, this is chapter 2 of Hillel Ticktin's Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, Essays on the Political Economy of a Disintegrating System, first published in 1992, republished in 2015. Alright, so this chapter or essay is titled Theory and Concepts. The purpose of this book is to provide an outline of a political economy of the USSR. It is my intention to grapple with that system's real as opposed to imagined, imposed, or believed contradictions. The advent of glasnost has shifted the study of the USSR away from a process of detection. There are more facts and statistics available, and truer histories as well. What remains urgently needed is a theoretical analysis that is neither apologetic nor ideologically opposed. The regime is still producing its own apologetics, even if they are of a more sophisticated kind, while much of the Western literature can only analyze the USSR in terms of orthodox economics, ideologically committed as it is to the market. The task of this book is therefore to take part in the discovery of the nature of the laws governing the USSR. In this endeavor, it tries to describe the changing social relations in the country. At this point, the reader may object that there are numerous such books available, both inside and outside the USSR. While the objection is valid, the fact is that Soviet writings have hitherto been of the purest apologetics, based neither on fact nor on theory. On the other hand, much of the work of the same kind in the West has been vitiated by a parallel attempt to impose a pre-existing idea or concept on reality. God damn it, there's a footnote. I gotta duplicate the chapter. There we are. Footnote. I include in this category such work as that of the state capitalist and worker state writers. See Tony Cliff, Russia, a Marxist Analysis, published with Pluto in 1970, and Ernest Mandel, Marxist Economics, published in 1968, and Beyond Perestroika, The Future of Gorbachev's USSR, published with Verso in 1989. End footnote. While there are interesting insights to be found in much of this work, it is less than useful for purposes of understanding. New section, Western Sovietology. The field of Soviet studies in the West has swung from the totalitarian to the interest group model. Footnote. For the totalitarian view, see Karl J. Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski's Totalitarian Dictatorship and Autocracy, published in 1969, and Leonard Shapiro, The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, published in 1970. In Friedrich and Brzezinski and Shapiro's view, the party is coterminous with the elite and almighty as against the masses. There is no social analysis at all. On the other hand, H. Gordon Skilling and Franklin Griffiths, in their edited volume, Interest Groups in Soviet Politics, published in 1971, show the existence of different interest groups on the Central Committee, but in failing to see that the groups lie exclusively within the elite itself, they fail to see the real dynamic in the USSR. Bella. Both models have had their uses. The totalitarian view argued that no independent organizational form could exist in the USSR, and hence the population was atomized. The essential dichotomy was one of elite and masses, and the Communist Party played the crucial role in the society insofar as the Communist Party was coterminous with the elite. All instructions came from above and no dissent was tolerated. This attitude was correct in pointing out the atomization of the population and the concentration of decision-making in the elite. The problem with the totalitarian model, however, was that it looked at society in purely political terms, where politics was defined as the act of making decisions.
Well, I guess.
Hey, sorry, I'm starting again. Totalitarians failed to understand the USSR because their concepts were incorrectly grounded. The term, quote, Communist Party, end quote, for example, might suggest that this entity is the same in the USSR as it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. That is dubious. If the Communist Party of the Soviet Union were abolished as a party, the CPSU would have to be reinvented as an integrating agency, which might simply be called the Civil Service Inspectorate. To say that the Communist Party is in power in the USSR means as much as saying that the elites rule. The totalitarians knew that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was not Marxist. But if it is not Marxist, and if today it is pragmatic and little else, then it is not very enlightening to discuss the USSR primarily in terms of one-party rule rather than no-party rule. This school of thought was succeeded by a more empirical view among scholars who see the USSR evolving under the influence of different interest groups. These scholars were found equally wanting, although for different reasons. At least the totalitarians pointed to a real relationship, however superficially. The empiricists could only repeat the Soviet literature in westernized form. While pointing to the existence of interest groups in the USSR, they left unexplored the crucial question: how does the elite rule? The term, quote, totalitarian, end quote, is now enjoying a renaissance in Eastern Europe, used to express the opposition of the new regimes and the ruling intelligentsia to the old forms of rule. Their use of the word is not very different, in that they counterpose multi-party formal democracy to the complete absence of real politics. The problem, however, is that Eastern Europe is different from the USSR. Nobody in Eastern Europe saw the Communist Party as a real ruling party. Its chief instrument was the secret police, an agency that was immediately attacked throughout Europe. The Communist Party itself very quickly dissolved with a mass desertion of members, most of whom had belonged only out of economic or political necessity, and with a rapid change of structure and title. These regimes only existed through the domination of the USSR, expressed through occupying troops and the control of the secret police. In fact, to make the same point in more detail, it was really Khrushchev who created the Stalinist Party as an instrument of rule, with regular congresses, committee meetings, and an invulnerable party apparatus. Accordingly, there is an argument to be made that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has only existed for a short time. One second. Where am I? Sorry, I'm trying to find a footnote. Wait, shit, where am I? Sorry. Fuck. My bad. I'm sure this is really annoying to listen to. Okay, footnote. And that footnote just says Roy Medvedev in Let History Judge stressed the radical discontinuity after the death of Stalin. End footnote. But it has never existed as a party in the usual sense of the term. for the simple reason that a single party cannot be a political party. A one-party system is a no-party system, a fact easily demonstrated by looking at the internal life of the CPSU. It does not exist in any real sense. Local parties simply have accepted instructions and decisions from above. In other words, there has been no real discussion, election from below, criticism from below, or indeed any real function for the local party other than the reception of documents which no one reads or heeds. On the other hand, the party had no necessity to contest elections, campaign to change minds, or perform in the manner that communist parties did before 1917 or in the rest of the world. The party congresses and central committee meetings were a forum for the elite, where the great bodies of state, the army, the secret police, and the bureaucratic apparatus, in their factionalized form, could display themselves. From this point of view, the introduction of an elected Congress of People's Deputies has created the potentiality of an actual party of the elite. That few would vote for the Communist Party if given genuinely free elections became quite clear. This did shake up the party and compel internal discussion. Yet, factions within the party are still banned, even if they do exist, and open platforms cannot be presented. There are no real elections to the relevant party bodies, only forms of representation of different sections of the party. Even where there are elections, they are carefully controlled to ensure the acceptance of the candidates. The plenum of the Central Committee that met on the 6th to 8th of February 1990 marked a turning point, celebrated by the Western press. Article 6 of the Constitution enshrining the special role of the Communist Party was slated for removal. The party was to become more democratic, and multi-party elections were to be permitted. What this really meant was that the Soviet elite would prefer to rule using formal elections, assuming that their own party would obtain sufficient consent to maintain the system. For the interest groups, the different sectional divisions provide an understanding of the elections to the Central Committee and the infighting over policy. The picture of the Soviet elite is also more realistic than that of the totalitarians. Nonetheless, the peculiarity of a regime that relies on a special form of atomization as a means of control needs to be understood and discussed. The totalitarians at least stressed this aspect of the society. It led them to conclude that the society was stable and without pressures at the top of the kind discussed by the new Soviet scholars. On that point they may have been wrong, but they did at least attempt to explain the nature of control in these societies. The advisory group around Ronald Reagan in his first term were the successors of the totalitarians. Richard Pipes in particular was a theorist of this type. But they went a step further and found that the USSR was dangerous, as it was both expansionary and disintegrating. Logically, the correct policy was the, quote, squeeze, end quote. The economic inefficiency of the regime conflicted with the harsh forms of control it maintained. The introduction of the element of economic inefficiency provided a dynamic for a view that until then had had none. The problem with this view is that it sees the market as both eternal and necessary. It assumes that only the market can provide the efficiency and elements of democracy needed for a stable and modern society. Adherents of this view fail to see that the majority of society will actually lose through the introduction of the market. Marketeers usually point out that this is temporary and that in the long run everyone will gain. Even were this true, a political question is posed that is, at the very least formidable. Allowing prices to rise, requiring people to work harder, and mandating a greater differentiation of incomes immediately benefits sections of the elite and the intelligentsia. The ordinary worker would actually be worse off, bad as his present position is. It is this dynamic that supporters of the market, of whatever ilk, neglect to face. The modern-day totalitarian theorists see only that a group of the Soviet elite have to be vanquished so that the market may be introduced. The assumption is extremely dubious. There is in fact no real evidence that the Soviet elite would not have preferred a market from the beginning. The logical founder of Stalinism is Bukharin, the inventor of the Stalinist doctrine of the possibility of building socialism in one country, who supported the continuation of the market-type economy in the 1920s. The obstacle to the introduction of the market, and hence a real change in the system, lies in the social structure. This is where the totalitarians failed, since they were unable to find a social structure at all. Had they done so, they could no longer have maintained that the USSR was strong, stable, or a world menace. Their explanation of atomization itself is political and hence insufficient. After all, how was it that the secret police were actually more powerful in the USSR than in Nazi Germany? Hitler destroyed mainly his political enemies and the Jews. Under Stalin, whole layers of the population were decimated. Trotsky, who still regarded the USSR as a workers' state, was nonetheless moved to remark in 1937 that the USSR under Stalin was politically worse than Germany under Hitler. Footnote. See Trotsky, The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, the Transitional Program, which is on this channel. Where am I? In other words, the absence, it should be kept in mind, though, that was Trotsky's writing prior to Barbarossa and the Holocaust. So we have to keep that very much in mind when we're talking about Trotsky's comparisons between fascism and Stalinism. In other words, the absence of a market and the strong internal controls reflect extreme instability, not stability. The elites would accept any solution that kept their powers intact. The market would indeed do so, even if not for every member. Put differently, the reason for the prescription of politics in the USSR lay in the danger of a rapid shift to the left and the overthrow of the Soviet elite. Even if the initial stages of democratization were favorable to the elite, this would rapidly cease. It is this problem that lies at the root of the enigma of Soviet politics. From this point of view, the failure of the different schools of establishment Soviet studies lies in their characterization of the USSR as an absurd deviant from the natural market economy. Both viewpoints fail to see that the USSR constitutes a conservative social formation that has taken on a monstrous and sui generis social form precisely in order to prevent social revolution. That is why many of its forms so resemble fascism, which was similarly concerned with avoiding social revolution. The interest group school has moreover failed to understand the real nature of the groups that they discovered. It is always possible in any economy to find a whole range of different interests. What is really important is the dynamic involved. Are there any social groups that are crucial? Are they exerting pressure? Is there a social group that is in control of the economy and is allocating privileges to itself? What is the nature of the challenges that it faces? The real question is not who supports what interests, but rather what is the social dynamic of the regime, which ultimately provides its politics. Here the interest group approach can actually detract from a more profound investigation of the nature of Soviet politics. If politics is concerned with the nature and forms of control over power in society, then the crucial issue is the nature of the social group in power and its relations with subordinate groups. Its own divisions and fractions will then reflect this fundamental relation. The concept used in this work. The key concepts used here are those of the surplus product, atomization, disintegration, contradiction, and class. The term, quote, surplus product, end quote, needs some explanation, especially in view of the term surplus product's checkered history. Marx used, quote, surplus value, end quote, to apply to capitalism, quote, surplus product, end quote, to apply to much or all of human history. Clearly, one cannot use a term applying to capitalism for the USSR unless one assumes that the USSR is itself capitalist. As investigators, we therefore have to begin with the more general term. The category of surplus product applies to the portion of the social product that a whole or part of the society has decided to allocate for uses other than the immediate satisfaction of needs of those engaged in productive work. In other words, those who produce the surplus product itself. The consumption of those not engaged in productive work is therefore part of the surplus product. The privileges of the Soviet elite, hidden as they are from view, are part of the surplus product. The state apparatus is paid out of the surplus product, hence the campaigns of both Gorbachev and Western countries to cut it back. In the case of the USSR, the unproductive consumption of the surplus product by the repressive apparatus is enormous. The army, the secret police, and the consumption of the elite all absorb a considerable portion of that surplus product. Yet it is the thesis of this book that it is not these forms of absorption that determine its direction, although they are crucial to our understanding of the USSR, but rather the enormous levels of useless productive consumption, or waste that result from the instability of the system. The category of waste is used in my work in Critique, the journal that Hillel Ticktin was like the main guy at, has been criticized by various writers and interlocutors. Baran and Sweezy, in their work, employed the term, quote, potential surplus, end quote, to denote the difference between what could be produced and what was actually the end product. Footnote. Paul Baran and Paul M. Sweezy, Monopoly Capital, 1966, and Paul Baran, The Political Economy of Growth, 1956. End footnote. They therefore invented the categories of actual and potential surplus. This had the great merit of reintroducing the concept of the surplus product in a period when it had fallen out of favor. It had the problem that it insufficiently theorized the difference between surplus value and the concepts that they had fashioned. No one else, however, has taken up the challenge of dealing with the differences between what could be produced with full utilization of the productive forces and what is produced. The effects of unemployment, undercapacity, utilization of plant, arms production, and duplication of efforts and resources as a result of competition are all examples of waste under capitalism. The USSR has its own forms of waste, and it is part of the aim of this book to show that the nature of that waste and its causes. Above all, it is our task here to discuss the form of the surplus product, and so to show the nature of the different kinds of utilization of the surplus product. The point, of course, is that the wasteful nature of Soviet production is a peculiarly Soviet form of the absorption of the surplus product. It is now possible to discuss the concept of waste more precisely. The simple use of the term, quote, waste, end quote, is too broad to constitute a category. More precisely defined, however, it refers to the use or lack of use of the surplus product in a manner that fails to lead to a product. In other words, labor is expended without any result. In principle, either necessary or surplus labor could be expended in a way that would lead to no product or even to a decline in production. The failure to use surplus labor also falls under the same rubric. The utilization of surplus labor in a way that leads to little or no increase in use values constitutes waste. In capitalism, there is a dual possibility of waste. If surplus value does not lead to further surplus value and so capital, we can speak of waste. If capital is employed but the commodity produced cannot be used and so produce further exchange value or be consumed, then we can speak of waste. The latter case is that of arms production. Under capitalism, the question of wasteful production is essentially a question of use values. But since capital is concerned with exchange values, the issue of waste appears secondary. Indeed, in terms of the contradictions within the system, it is secondary. The fact that there is potential for producing more use value is interesting and important, but not the immediate cause of difficulty for the system. It is proof that the system is in decline because it shows that an alternative system could utilize the productive forces more fully. It is also true, as various writers have argued, that the absorption of surplus value by the unproductive sector is important in reducing the rate of accumulation of capital, but this is quite another argument. There is no reason to equate the unproductive sector with waste. In the case of the USSR, however, use value is all important. Hence, the same problem that may appear as one of many difficulties in capitalism is of a crucial moment under the Soviet system. The production of poor quality housing under capitalism is a fact of life that may increase the profits of the construction companies. In the USSR, it leads to enormous costs of repair, problems of replacement, and to an absorption of resources that the system cannot afford. Footnote. In an article devoted to Soviet housing, one author points out
that the new Soviet housing becomes dilapidated so quickly that around 20% of it is unusable. Motherfucker. That's from M. Krushinsky. Izvestia, 14th of July, 1988. Where the hell am I? Fuck, I said footnote. The footnote's over. I can't find where I am. It can also lead, coincidentally, to the collapse of that housing under stress, as in the Armenian earthquake of December 1988, at which point it can then become of political importance. According to Wikipedia, the 1980 Armenian earthquake, also known as Spitak earthquake, occurred on the 7th of December at 11:41 local time with a surface wave magnitude of 6.8 and a maximum MSK intensity of X. The shock occurred in the northern region of Armenia, then Armenian SSR, as part of the Soviet Union, which is vulnerable to large and destructive earthquakes and is part of a larger active seismic belt that stretches from the Alps to the Himalayas. Activity in the area is associated with tectonic plate boundary interaction, and the source of the event was slip on a thrust fault just to the north of Spitak. The complex incident ruptured multiple faults, with a strike-slip event occurring shortly after the initiation of the main shock. Between 25,000 and 50,000 were killed, and up to 130,000 were injured. Seismologists thoroughly studied the effects of the Spitak event, including the main shock and aftershock fault rupture mechanisms, and were on site setting up temporary seismometers. Before the end of 1988, earthquake engineering experts scrutinized building construction styles and found fault in the poorly constructed apartments and other buildings that were built during the era of stagnation under the rule of Leonid Brezhnev. The cities of Spitak, Leninakan, Gyumri, and Kirovakan, or Vanadzor, were greatly affected with large losses of life and devastating effects to buildings and other structures. A number of the smaller outlying villages away from the larger population centers were also severely affected. Despite the tensions of the Cold War, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev formally asked the United States for humanitarian help within a few days of the earthquake, the first such request since the late 1940s. 113 countries sent substantial amounts of humanitarian aid to the Soviet Union in the form of rescue equipment, search teams and medical supplies. Private donations and assistance from non-governmental organizations also used a large part of the international effort. While transporting some of these supplies to the region, a Soviet aircraft carrying 9 crew members and 69 military personnel, and a transport plane from Yugoslavia were both destroyed in separate incidents. In support of the relief effort, recording artists united to produce several music-related contributions for the victims of the quake. A song was produced by the duo of French composers Charles Aznavour, and a studio album that featured songs donated by mainstream rock bands was released from the Rock Aid Armenia effort by the British music industry. Back to the text. Indeed, it is now possible to go beyond the category of waste to the essential dynamic of the USSR. This will be discussed in a separate chapter, but it is useful to go through the fundamental thesis as well as basic terms. The quality of Soviet goods, the very long periods of time taken to construct anything, and the low level of Soviet technology are symptoms not just of a wasteful use of the surplus product, but of the nature of the contradiction in the USSR. Whereas under capitalism, the contradiction is between use value and exchange value, more precisely value. Exchange value is a little bit more of a concrete category than value. In the USSR, that's just a side note for myself. In the USSR, it is within the product itself. It is not therefore a question of waste being a fundamental category. Waste is a symptom and a result of more profound forces at work. The argument is that the contradiction within use value itself leads to the production of goods with defective use value. In turn, the contradiction is seen as lying between a real use value and a potential use value. In other words, a jacket will serve as a jacket even if one arm is shorter than the other, so it has a real use value. But the use value is less than that of a jacket with two arms of the same length. A machine tool with a defective part might turn out products that can be used in the production of an automobile, but it makes the car closer to a heap of non-performing metal than it need be. The effect is to drive consumption and production apart, and throughout the system, the contradiction between what is produced and what is needed tends to be aggravated. The history of the Soviet Union is the history of the measures taken to ameliorate that tension. Market surrogates, terror, and administrative measures have all been used in attempts to establish the viability of the system. The contradiction between the two forms of use value is in its turn a consequence and a cause of the nature of the U.S. labor in the USSR. Since commodities are not produced in the USSR, labor power cannot be a commodity, but labor power can be alienated. In other words, the nature of labor power as a product is also defective. It can be bought and sold as a commodity, and so the worker retains a degree of control over his labor power. On the other hand, he has to alienate his product to the management. He cannot choose not to work, but he can choose not to work as management would prefer he work. His actual work differs, in other words, from his potential work. His product, therefore, is of the same kind. The labor process is therefore driven apart from the product. On the one hand, the product is alienated to the management, and so to the elite or bureaucratic system, while on the other hand, the labor process remains in the control of the laborers themselves. The contradiction derives from the defective nature of the product, and so of labor power as such, and leads to a sundering of the process of production itself. Such control over the work process, however, has acted as a means of stabilizing the system by atomizing the worker. The worker relates to his own work process rather than to other workers, so that his control is an individual control rather than a collective control as it might be in the West. A chapter of this book is devoted to this process of atomization. The atomization of the population stabilized the system. At the same time, it provided the basis for the production of defective use values, and so created an insuperable barrier to production itself. The atomization of the population was established in the 1930s in the course of a long struggle with the workers in the USSR. It has moved from a simple individual form to one that is less individualized, and we can expect it to become collective, at which point the system will have little life left in it. The worker today controls his work process by individually working at his own rate. The norms are spontaneously set at low levels to conform to this situation. When the norms are set by agreement with the workforce, through a general meeting or by some form of election of delegates, there will be a limited collective form of control over the labor process. But it is still an atomized form to the degree that it is performed by each unit rather than by the economy or society as a whole. This latter point, however, has not been reached even under Gorbachev. All the controls over the individual remain in place through the instrument of the secret police, controls over movement, severe limitations on organization, and the absence of genuine trade unions. The degree of criticism of the previous regimes has been vastly expanded, and criticism of the present government is permitted within limits. The atomization of the individual in the USSR, then, has been through a number of stages. Beginning with the ban on all non-state organizations, it is extended to a total atomization, which has been gradually dissolved since the death of Stalin. It is in the analysis of the stages and levels of atomization, which is so crucial to the system, that an understanding of the process of the disintegration of the system can evolve. The period of Gorbachev can then be understood as the elite's last-ditch attempt to maintain itself in power by making minimal concessions before its controls disappear altogether. The argument, to sum up, begins with the symptom of waste, and shows that underlying waste is a contradiction in the nature of the product, which in turn is based on the contradiction within labor and labor power. The contradictions lead to an antagonism or an absolute contradiction between consumption and production, labor and the labor process, production and circulation, and indeed in all aspects of the economy. The question is not why it is breaking down, but why it functioned for so long and why it is breaking down now. The word, quote, contradiction, end quote, is used extensively in this book. It is used in its Hegelian and Marxist sense of a necessary relation between opposites and that interpenetrate and change each other. The opposites are part of an entity. In the case of capitalism, the entity is the commodity, and the opposites are use value and exchange value. In the USSR, the entity is the product, and the opposites are the actual real use value and the potential formal use value. The change wrought by the interpenetration of opposites ultimately leads to the supersession of the entity. Until the new entity is formed, the poles of the contradiction may stand opposed to one another in direct conflict. In such a case, the system will be in a crisis. The crisis can be resolved either through supersession or through a return to the interrelation between the two opposite poles. If it is not resolved, then the system itself must disintegrate. This, we will argue, is what is occurring in the USSR. In this respect, the category of, quote, disintegration, end quote, is employed and needs to be explained. What I am arguing here is that the USSR is not a viable social formation, that the USSR is not a mode of production comparable to capitalism or feudalism, as indeed follows from the above discussion, but this does not imply the USSR will break down tomorrow. On the contrary, the USSR has its own form of limited stability as well as its own form of decay. The USSR is a regime that cannot permit opposition to exist, and hence its decline can only take the form of disintegration of the system, the pulling apart of the poles of the system, so that the social groups, factions, and economic categories each stand in opposing and non-cooperating forms, is the form of disintegration. In the end, the disintegration must reach a point where the workers will constitute their own collectivity and so become a class and make their own bid for power. Quote, class here is defined as a social group that has constituted itself a collectivity around a specific relation to the surplus product. In the context of the USSR, those who alienate their labor power in order to produce the surplus product are the workers. They are at present atomized, but when the disintegration proceeds to the point where that atomization is overcome, they can become a collectivity. At that point, the system will have to change. It is, of course, in the nature of the system that it has done and will do its utmost to prevent the formation of such a collectivity. It does so by atomizing the population, but it is increasingly inefficient to maintain the atomization, and consequently, its limits are rapidly being reached. The system is today in the process of rapid change. This book tries to illustrate its thesis with an analysis of the present situation. The situation under Gorbachev is certainly different from that under Stalin, but the essential problems are the same. The USSR is a society, neither socialist nor capitalist, that has the incentives of neither, but is driven to expand production in order to maintain the ruling group in power, while it lacks means of calculation, control over labor, or the stimuli needed for action and decision-making. It is neither planned nor based on the market, and yet there is no third way. In philosophical terms, there are only capitalism and capitalism's essence, the law of value, and socialism with socialism's essence, the law of planning. Anything in between can only fail precisely because it has no essence, no nature. It can have no laws except ones of formation and decay. The Soviet elite desperately want to introduce the market or the law of value, and so secure their own position. There is no mature form of the USSR. It is a historical accident, an accident brought about through the defeat of the October Revolution in the form of the seizure of power by a bureaucratic ruling group. Just as Neanderthal man could never become man, so the USSR can never reform to become socialism or capitalism. It is an unfortunate deviation of history, which is now under Gorbachev coming to an end. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2, or essay 2 of this book. I think these can be called, it says essays, but I think these can be called chapters. They're referencing like the future and like future parts of the text. So I'm going to say this is, I'm going to go ahead and take the liberty of calling this a chapter. This chapter was chapter 2, and it's called Theory and Concepts, plural. And the next one is chapter 3, and is titled The Nature of Social Control in the USSR. Thank you so much for listening.